All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the brand new Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've recorded more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, almost all on foreign policy, and all available for you at scotthorton.org. You can sign up for the podcast feed there, and the full interview archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. Hey, man, on the line, I've got Joseph Solis-Mullen, and he wrote a great book that we published at the Institute called The Fake China Threat, and it's very real danger. And he's some kind of fellow or another. I can't keep him straight anymore, but he writes all this great stuff at the Libertarian Institute, including this one is called Washington Takes Another L in China Policy. Welcome back to the show. Joe, how you doing?
Hi, Scott. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. Appreciate you joining us here. Hey, and also I appreciate you keeping up with the China stuff for me, because not only am I behind on the Middle East, I'm like not even trying on the East at all. So it's very important that you're doing this work and giving me a chance to publish it so I can take 0.1% of the credit for your work here. So please do tell us about this article. It's about, I don't even know how to say it, the Chinese telephone company there?
Huawei.
Okay, well, you say it more. Huawei. So America's been waging an economic war against them. Got to keep them from having the best microchips, which I thought that was mostly about cruise missiles and stuff. But anyway, I really don't know nothing. So you tell me all about the chip war and how well it's going, please.
Well, this all kind of ties into the broader economic war against China, as you pointed out. But what the original policy was aimed at preventing Huawei getting 5G network contracts. That essentially this is going to be the backbone of the future communications architecture. And Huawei, which was offering very, very competitive advanced equipment in competition, was scoring all these contracts all over the world. And so Washington, in order to prevent this Chinese firm from getting to lay this architecture for the future of communications around the globe, tried to kneecap it. This started under the Trump administration, and initially the Hawks were very, very bullish. They always are, though, aren't they? They're always very bullish when it first starts out. This is going to be great. It's going to be easy, great. We're sure to win. And I quote Chris Miller, whose book Chip War is a favorite of the Hawks, writing in the New York Times how, Washington's going to decapitate Huawei, and isn't it going to be grand? And like I said, initially they did struggle because they got a large amount of their supply chain shut down pretty much overnight. And it took a while for them to retool, almost 2 full years. But late in the third quarter last year, they started posting huge gains in revenue. And then earlier this year, they started releasing all this new tech, including an in-house operating system for to run their software. And it's just the latest example of, forcing China to be more dependent on itself, just blowing up in Washington's face. Like, we should be wanting to be more interdependent, especially because China is making such tremendous leaps in things like battery technology, for example. China has a virtual monopoly on rare earth metals. Like, these are all things that, could very much benefit consumers in China and in the United States working more closely together. But instead, what's happening is Washington is attempting these foolish policies that aren't working and that are raising costs across the board and increasing the likelihood of conflict long term. I was just reading an article in the Financial Times the other day. The CEO of Raytheon, he was saying, look, we can't decouple from China. We have thousands of suppliers tied into China. We can't do it. We're going to work to do it. It's going to take years, though. And so, in the meantime, we can de-risk. Well, what de-risk means is it means duplicating your supply chains. That just means raising the cost, which in the case of Raytheon is cost directly footed by the taxpayers. So it's all totally self-defeating and pointless. But that was the latest on the Huawei front. The other one that I had written and that Connor had reached out to me about was the one from last week about Washington seemingly trying to provoke China into a war while gaslighting us all like it's some sort of accident, like we're like sleepwalking into it or something. So over the last week, I've been kind of mulling it over because I know your new book is going to be called Provoked. I'm thinking about just already starting, because you didn't start working on that book. Correct me if I'm wrong. You didn't start working on that book until like after the invasion had started, right? Like on a Russia book.
Yeah. It had been a speech that I'd given, and then I made it twice as long. I gave the speech originally in 2020, and then I made it about twice as long for 2022, and then I basically started embellishing it out from there.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to start writing Provoked China edition like right now. I think I'm just going to start it right now. I'll just be ready.
Yeah.
Because it just seems like that's where we're going. All the same forces are in play.
Yeah. Well, and just on that last point, and we'll figure out a title, but on the thing about, sleepwalking into war and blundering into war, they always do that. There's this communist writer that I like named Adam Johnson, and he's a good dude, and I'm not saying I appreciate his economics all that much, but he talks about how they just always get away with that. Oh, we're blundering into war. We're sleepwalking into war. Like, what are you talking about? All of you people get up in the morning, wide awake, take your Adderall, go to work, and make these decisions, right? Like, what are you talking about sleepwalking? You're doing it. That's what it is. Damn it. And somehow they always do that. And they're like, these wars just sneak up upon our world empire, Joe, like the Indians ambushing the white guys in every Western that was ever made.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I think too that if you look at the books that come out, they talk about these forces, these material and historical forces, and they're just, what can you do, Scott? They're these immaterial forces. You can't grab onto them. You can't do anything. You're a victim of these currents, these flows, these forces. That's one of the reasons I think that libertarian critical theory is so important, is because someone like Murray Rothbard said, hold on, we can actually point to the person making these decisions. We can point to the incentive structures that they created within these institutions that allowed these things to happen. I actually wrote an article back at the Mises Institute, a critical perspective on the outbreak of World War I, which World War I, there's a great book, a popular history called by Chris Clark called Sleepwalkers, and it's about the outbreak of World War I. And I said, look, if you look at the actual decision architecture facing each of those leaders, the only one of them that didn't go to war for domestic political reasons was Great Britain. Like, all of the other ones were primarily focused on their domestic political circumstances.
Isn't that interesting? And that was Justin Raimondo's theory of libertarian realism, was that all foreign politics are ultimately determined by domestic concerns. And especially like on that most simple George Lucas level, start a war to extend your term in power,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that was exactly the line that got me thinking. I was like, I wonder if this applies even to World War I. The war that everyone just agrees is like, oh my goodness, no, the causes go all the way back into the 1860s, 1870s, and it was tens of different forces all combining together. No, in the final analysis, it was deliberate decisions made to avoid possible negative domestic political consequences, both in Russia, in Austria, and in Germany. And in France. And
just look at our era. I mean, our whole millennium here, our new century, was kicked off by George Bush making this huge unforced error on the part of the Ayatollah and bin Laden on the other side. I guess Israel got to save a nickel on a barrel of oil, but otherwise, only America's adversaries benefited from that. And it didn't have to happen at all.
Yeah,
and we're rolling in.
All
right, on your market, set, go on a completely unprovoked, aggressive invasion. So how do you like that?
I was thinking about that this morning because I was just reviewing a congressional studies report on U.S. treaty commitments to Japan and the Philippines. So there's an institute whose job it is to like provide Congress with research. It's called the Congressional Research Institute. And so I was just reviewing these things and looking at some of the discussions that were going on in the 1990s. And it really does look like things were going to heat up in Southeast Asia between the US and China in the 1990s before George W. Bush just grabbed the wheel and like yanked it off into the Middle East. And things were just kind of allowed to just go on autopilot over there. But I do wonder whether or not we would have been having these sorts of very confrontational moments with China much earlier, basically, and what that would have looked like. Because obviously now there's a very high degree of parity in that immediate theater in all the types of weapons platforms that matter to a conflict over like Taiwan or over something in the East or South China Seas. Which is really concerning, obviously, especially with the Philippines and Japan, because those are actual treaty allies.
Right. Yeah, and it was in the first year or first 8 months or 9 months of W. Bush there, it was all about the Pacific because that's where you get to sell your missile defense systems and Navy ships and long-range bombers and all of this. And that was in their interest right away. That was the initial project, even of the neocons. Was, we'll get to Baghdad, but first we got to make sure to get these missile defense systems going. And it was, they say, let's see, I think it was Norman Solomon's movie, War Made Easy. I think that does the best job of showing how Colin Powell's last stand was in the spring of '01 when they were brand new in there and the spy plane crashed with the Chinese plane. It was forced down. And they had to negotiate to get it back. And Colin Powell said, instead of grandstanding and playing tough guy, we're going to play it real cool and we're going to negotiate this the right way. And he had to kind of face down Cheney and the right inside the cabinet to do that. But then that was like every last bit of his political capital. He never won another fight against the Hawks, or at least, yeah, I guess not.
They wound up getting crushed for that. Yeah. They wound up getting crushed for that in the media.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure they did.
They're weak. Oh, bowing and scraping to the Chinese, as our spy plane, their spy plane, Washington's spy plane is just chilling out over like Hainan Island, right? Yeah. Which like point to that on a map for me, any American, please.
Oh, and they'll say cynically, Joe, that because this guy Powell, he had economic interests in mind. But like, yeah, I know that's the whole point. It's because being a sellout is bad, but being dead in a war is worse. That's why. Like, we don't want to compromise our rights with them. We don't have to compromise our political system with theirs, but to make our trade interdependent with theirs, whatever sacrifices supposedly come from that. I mean, we do lose jobs, but then again, we get lower prices to beat inflation and whatever. I don't know how it balances out, but. Well, and I know there's a lot of government intervention on both sides or all sides of those equations, but overall, this is the theory of World War I that I thought was so compelling, and I don't know nothing about it, but I read one great book about. No, I read a few, but Wilson's War, which blames all of history ever since then on Woodrow Wilson, quite aptly, I think. He says in there, it might be in the introduction, it's James Powell, and he says the countries that were the Central Powers and the Allied powers in World War I had previously been the massive trade blocs. They were sort of free trade zones. They had divided, but they weren't free trade zones with each other. They were only, they were these multinational sort of, pseudo Articles of Confederation type situations. And those are the dividing lines that went to war. His point being, geez, if they had only had free trade between those two blocks, then they wouldn't have fought. But instead, it was like, we want the metal in that mine, which is on the wrong side of the line. So we're going to kill you and take that mine from you is what we're going to do, where they could have just been trading over it,
Yeah, and as you said, it's a complicated situation in terms of who loses out, who gains what. Yes, it is political because these free trade agreements are not actually free, quote unquote, libertarian free trade agreements, because, of course, you could write an actual libertarian free trade agreement on a bar napkin, right? It would say no subsidies, no tariffs, no quotas, just trade. That's not what happened. That's why these agreements are thousands of pages long. Because it's carving out all sorts of exceptions and exemptions and creating all these regulations to favor one corporation instead of another. Even efforts like the EU. The EU has an agricultural policy because France wouldn't go along with it unless they could protect their own farmers, right? Because they're an important political bloc. So, yeah, but generally speaking, even with all that said, yes, it's true. The United States would have lost jobs eventually to some country just because of the comparative advantage of lower labor costs in other countries. Like that just would have happened anyway. Maybe it happened faster because of certain government policies. I've argued that in an article I wrote at the Institute actually last year, trading the Rust Belt for military bases, where I said, look, what Washington did is they set up asymmetrical free trade. They opened up the American market to Japan in exchange for more favorable basing agreements, in exchange for payments to offset that stuff, and in exchange opened up the market in the United States for Japan to, dump product into. So there was stuff like that going on, but certainly we would be better off if there was more trade. Like I said, the Raytheon, yeah. One of the critical aspects, one of the critical players in the military-industrial complex, they can't function without China, right? Like they need Chinese suppliers. They can't do without. It will take years, they said,
and think about
retool
that.
Everything to
where
not
you build your national defense structure to be reliant on your supposed adversary in the world, the competing power in the world. I mean, I'm all for free trade, but that doesn't seem to make much sense. In fact, I guess I'm for that more than anything. Like, well, I guess we can't fight them if our planes don't fly without them.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, I mean, just realistically, and I've written a lot about this. Like, China is going to be a powerful regional player over there. They are not going to take over the world. Even the stuff we're talking about with the South China Sea, like, there are so many different claimants there. Like this is why Washington needs to be much more needs to take a step back and be more perspicacious and be more sagacious about what it's doing here, because this thing could blow up in a heartbeat. I mean, there are so many different competing claims there, and all it takes is one little incident. That's why everyone points to, the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that did it. No, that there was just a ton of gasoline and gunpowder that they had been filling this room up with. And then someone was lighting a cigarette and accidentally dropped a match. That was the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Yeah. And that's what we have going on here now. We have the United States, putting soldiers on Jinmin Island, within sight of the mainland. We have the United States saying that we will absolutely defend any claim that the Philippines has to any speck of rock in the South China Sea. It's just crazy stuff here. Engaging in more and more arms sales to Taiwan. And Xi, was it 2 months ago when he was meeting with Ursula von der Leyen, he said, it feels like America is trying to provoke us into doing something. The Chinese general who was speaking at ASEAN, he was saying, these are red lines for us. And it's just like, are you guys not listening to this? Like, didn't we just have this happen in Eastern Europe? But then what's going to happen is going to happen, and they're going to come out and gaslight the American people like, oh my God, this unprovoked, how did it happen? And if you come forward, and you know this better than anyone, if you come out and try and explain this stuff, it's not because you're apologizing and defending an invasion of one country by another. It's simply explaining why this happened and how it was very preventable. Yeah. And if a conflict happens in this area, I mean, it's not going to be like what happened in Ukraine with Ukraine and Russia. Like those are fairly, in the case of Ukraine, a totally negligible economic player in the world. Russia is important for raw materials and stuff, but really, I mean, China, Japan, the United States, I mean, we're talking about the largest economies in the world. Mm-hmm. They're so interdependent on each other. If there were a conflict here, like, oh man, there would be so much suffering around the world, and we even we in the advanced industrial economies, we would be so much worse off, so much poorer.
People say to me, Scott, how do you get so much work done all the time? Coffee. It helps keep me from falling asleep. And it tastes really good because I get it from Moondose Artisan Coffee at moondoseartisancoffee.com. Moondose is kind of the anti-Starbucks in that their coffee tastes real good. They have lots of great choices, representing all kinds of regions, blends, and flavors. I'm drinking the Ethiopian presently. Hey, wait, also, do you like saving money on good-tasting coffee? Right now, you can get 10% off and help support this show if you just go to moondozartisancoffee.com/Horton. Find the link and the QR code in the margin at scotthorton.org. That's moondozartisancoffee.com/Horton. Hey guys, I had some wasps in my house, so I shot them to death with my trusty Bug Assault 3.0 model with the improved salt reservoir and bar safety. I don't have a deal with them, but the show does earn a kickback every time you get a Bug Assault or anything else you buy from Amazon.com by way of the link in the right-hand margin on the front page at scotthorton.org. So keep that in mind. And don't worry about the mess. Your wife will clean it up. Well, folks, sad to say, they lied us into war. All of them. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq War I, Serbia, Afghanistan, Iraq War II, Libya, Syria, Yemen. All of them. But now you can get the ebook, All the War Lies, by me for free. Just sign up for the email list at the bottom of the page at scotthorton.org or go to scotthorton.org/subscribe. Get All the War Lies by me for free. And then you'll never have to believe them again. Yeah, when it comes to Russia, I mean, their natural resources are important for Europe, which we're in competition with Russia for those markets, right? So you see, as Rand Paul pointed out in a great article, that it ain't no coincidence that my buddy Ted Cruz from the natural gas state of Texas is such a big hawk on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline here. You know, this is mercantilism, he said. Senator Paul said about his buddy. you know?
And he was right.
Yeah. So
he was absolutely right.
Yeah. So, but in other words, though, losing Russia to the world economy, isolating them, containing them in this way, at least in the minds in D.C., is beneficial. You know, at least I guess we could concede that it doesn't cost us much, you know what I mean, other than the prospects for peace. But in the sense that you're talking about economically, it doesn't hurt us really. But as you're saying here, a major disruption, never mind nuclear war and all that, but just any real major disruption and shutdown of trade between America and China could be really bad for a lot of people. Although, I don't know, I guess the Chinese just trade with everybody else the same as the Russians are doing now. You want to kick us out of the world? Let's make our own world. They happen to represent 2/3 or 3/4 of the population of the planet when it comes to, you know, the BRICS and the global South and all of that. The West calls themselves the world international community, but they're really not.
No, you're right about that. First of all, what you were saying in terms of like, yes, this is one of the problems with these permanent military alliance structures. Like, you can temporarily have the interests of different states, you know, so-called align temporarily, but eventually they very quickly diverge. And in the case of Europe and Washington, it was very obvious that Washington, provoking this war and getting Russia kicked out of Europe, like, that only made Europe more dependent on Washington. It only made things more difficult for the Europeans. And the same thing, I think, would be true in East Asia. And that might be the calculation with trying to provoke a war right now, which is, look, this would just make Japan and South Korea and the Philippines and Indonesia more dependent on us. And in terms of China being able to trade with the rest of the world, yes, it's true, except that their major consumer markets are all in the United States and Europe. That's where the major developed consumer markets are. So, yes, China could start trying to, and China does obviously trade with the rest of the world, but in terms of dollar value, like in terms of just how much is going where, there's just no substitute for the consumer markets in the United States and in Europe. And that's why it gets so difficult to imagine a conflict between them, because we couldn't stop importing things from China and they couldn't really afford to stop exporting things to us. And so it's just, it becomes a very weird mental exercise
help me understand this. This is something that's hard for me to imagine. The degree of trade before compared to now. I know that Biden hadn't undone a single thing that Trump did with the tariffs, and Trump is now promising even more, boasting about that and promising even more. And sometimes his people talk about completely shutting off trade between the two countries, so this kind of thing. But like on a scale of 1 to 10, if 10 is where we were on full scale trade, where are we now?
We're at like a 9 or a 10. I mean, it's just absolutely crazy
So
how
it really
little
hasn't
these
changed
sanctions
much
have
really
done.
at all.
Not it. No, I mean, it's absolutely incredible. I mean, we'll see what this latest round of incredible protection that they're throwing up will do in terms of EV components, but no, it has done absolutely nothing. And there's every once in a while a story will appear in The Economist or in the Wall Street Journal about how these sanctions are, about how this economic warfare is not working, about how number one, it's just raising prices, and number two, the goods are still coming into the country anyway. One of the ways this is happening is that only shipping containers they don't really get searched, and only ones over a certain amount of weight will get unpacked and looked at. And so basically they're just breaking up these deliveries into smaller parcels and then just shipping them over anyway. They've been bringing things in through Mexico. There was actually just something yesterday, an attempt to slow down the smuggling of this stuff in through Mexico, and then going the opposite way. There was just a story last week in the Wall Street Journal about this like cottage industry of smuggling chips into China, like NVIDIA processors. So again, like all that happens when you put up sanctions like this is you raise the price, which attracts people into that black market, and then the trade just keeps happening anyway.
Yeah.
And in the United States, it's just, yeah, go ahead.
Well, Joe, so like there's this guy, John Robb, that I like, and he writes interesting stuff, and he seems to have a point. I think you write about this in the book, about how Milton Friedman and these others who had gone and taught Deng Xiaoping about prices and markets and stuff like that they had succeeded to a great degree, but that essentially they had placed a bet. This was the Clinton administration's bet in the 90s. If we bring them into the World Trade Organization, we ship all our manufacturing over there, we make good capitalists out of them and property rights holders out of them, then eventually they'll adopt the rest of liberty too and, abandon communism and become a limited republic of some kind or something. But that didn't work out. Instead, they switched from communism to fascism, basically, still a tyranny, only with, highly regulated capitalism under their control. And so... but it's a tyranny and it's a horrible one. And so the gamble didn't work off. And I'm not sure like where that leaves us. That means we should have an economic war instead. But I guess it does mean that, I guess his point is just that Washington is in effect really subsidized through the WTO. If you look at it that way, by ending all protection, that America really built up this massive tyranny, like this gave them this massive economy to tax and build a giant government out of, like a more powerful government than ever before. And I know it's not exactly one-to-one equivalent, but they've got the biggest Navy in the world now. So far, they're not using it for any far-flung missions, but you see what I mean? That's the argument, that this whole thing was a mistake. We should have said, oh, they're communists? Good. The more they're communists, the less they're ever going to be a threat, because they're going to be too busy trying to figure out how to feed each other. And they won't be able to build up, so.
Well, it was, again, it's part of the temptation, especially among the academy, which is weird because, I'm a historian. And so a lot of times I'm going back and reading books from like the 50s, 60s, 70s, etc. Older too, but, just to give you an example. And there was just this reading of history that just saw the trajectory of the West as universally applicable to all places. And development theory is what grew out of this. And this goes all the way back to, Hegelian, Marxian type stuff that found its way into the social sciences. But the idea was that once societies reach a certain threshold of wealth, that a middle class will be created, that this middle class will militate to be part of the decision-making apparatus, to be able to make laws to protect itself. And that this is where representative government comes from. And that if you just give them the money, if you just make them rich, then that's just what happens. It automatically happens. It's just part of development theory. Ignoring the very specific, highly particular circumstances that allowed this to slowly emerge in Western Europe over the course of 1,000 years, right? 1,500 years, really. I mean, going back even further than that, if you really want to like tie in old Roman law and the traditions and how those fused with different Germanic tribal customs and whatnot, like this was just a highly particular historical development. And it's one that you're always having to push back against the temptation of centralizing state power to infringe upon, something that we've been losing out on in the United States, obviously. But this was something that they kind of ignored and just said no. Like if you just give them markets, if you give them prices, the economy will flourish, wealth will develop, a middle class will develop, the middle class will demand political rights, and because that's how it happened here, and that's just how what'll happen in China. And of course that didn't happen. That didn't happen in China. And so now you're faced with this conundrum. Well, now we've made, a pure competitor for ourselves. And now what do? What really worries me is that the current crop of quote unquote diplomats in the United States, policymakers, they came of age in the 1990s and in the 2000s, and they just grew up on that heady, intoxicating brew of unipolarity. And they just don't have the wisdom of someone like, say, like a Richard Nixon or something, you know what I mean? Which, like, not to give Nixon too much credit, but like he was able to sit down and look at someone like Brezhnev and say, look, this is just another world leader, powerful country. We have to find a way to get along. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Our diplomats do not have the ability to treat another country as having legitimate interests. Like Russia has to be the devil. Right. Xi Jinping has to be Satan.
All right, I'm sorry.
He can't just be the conservative leader of a proud, strong country that has some local red lines that they don't want tread upon.
Yeah. No, Biden is the perfect avatar for the whole empire. It's just this completely demented, crooked, old, stuck in some previous era thinking crazy thing. But and I have to go like right now, but I want to ask you one more thing, so please answer as quick as you can. But tell me a bit about, you mentioned previously this statement that America, by Chairman Xi, that America was trying to trick them into attacking Taiwan there.
Yeah, he said it to the leader of the European, I think she's the president of the EU right now, Ursula von der Leyen. He just said, look, it feels like America is trying to provoke us into attacking Taiwan with all of their behavior.
Did he did he mention specific things that were like,
It was in the context of how the United States is trying to turn Europe against China, because they had signed this big joint investment agreement, and the United States had put pressure on them to put a hold on it over basically Beijing's retaliation against some diplomats from some of the smaller, Latvia, Estonia type countries who were supporting Taiwan in certain ways. Mm-hmm. And so that was part of the context there. Mm-hmm. But he was just complaining, saying like, look, we want to have a good relationship with you, but we feel like what's going to happen is we're getting provoked into attacking them. And then, the U.S. is going to put pressure on you to come after us with them, Right. And Emmanuel Macron, say whatever you want about him, but he literally last year was like, we shouldn't do that. That would be dumb. We need to say no, which is true. They do.
Yeah, seriously. All right. Well, listen, we're out of time, but thank you so much for your time, everybody. That's Joe Solis-Mullen. He writes for us at the Institute. He wrote this great book, The Fake China Threat, and it's very real danger. And you can find him at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org. Washington takes another L, and Washington is sprinting, not sleepwalking, into war with China. Thank you. The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in L.A., APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.